why it is important to study religion in academia?
Big question. Um, it An answer to that, I guess, presupposes, I don't want to, get us in the weeds right away, but it presupposes how you define religion, what you then think the function of religion is. There's anybody familiar with debates in the academic study of religion as it took shape in Europe in the late 19th century and then spread around the world, in various forms. The International Association for the History of Religions, the IAHR, a number of people here either might be familiar with it or some might be going. People are arriving right now in Krakow in Poland for every 5 years they have a World Congress. So there's national organizations. Nobody belongs to the IHR. You belong to your national organization, which is then affiliated with it. So scholars from around the world are those able to travel are going there right now. So the study of religion is worldwide. But in saying the study of religion is worldwide, it glosses over really significant differences that I think everybody would agree, regardless which of those you think should be victorious, really significant differences in what counts as a religion, what counts as a way to study it, what religion's function is. So, at the one end of the perspective, religion is what I do, and everybody else is in trouble, right? Like, there are people who think that, and maybe some people on this call do, maybe not. But we all know people probably. We could find people, and they might want to study religion. So, what is the study of religion in that case? And on the very far other end, we would have, a classic kind of Marxist position where it's highly problematic and in a classic early 20th century scholarly tone, secularization ought to take over, and if we can solve the issues that religion is addressing, hey, Freud, Marx, it'll go away. So, what do we mean by the study of religion in that? For me, and we can talk a lot more about this if you want, but I'll just say briefly, um, religion is a historically, socially local word that, again, gets exported around the world and used in a variety of ways, but often used. Um, as a mode of authorizing very mundane social, political, economic processes. So why it's important to study religion for me is, given how I understand, important to study the ways in which social contests are managed and moderated. And whatever you think those contests, whichever direction you think they should go, we might not agree on that, but it probably is useful for us to understand how the game works. And I could talk more about that, but that's why it strikes me as important to study. It doesn't strike me as important to study because it will save souls. There are people who say that. It doesn't strike me that it's important to study because it's deeply meaningful and a transhuman experience that we have. I would say the category of religion and the discourses around religion function with regard to mundane social, political, economic management issues. And so studying how those issues work, we need to study how people talk about religion. Started up until the 60s or 70s, this way of talking and style of doing scholarship was very persuasive to a lot of people. Of course, those contesting what the study of religion was trying to attain to this day, as you just described, were not content with subjective, objective, biased, unbiased, this framework that was being used, and they more than understood that they were getting the short end of the stick, as we would say here. They were, being critiqued and marginalized in this. The classic response was, it's all subjective. Everybody has norms, and it's easy in contemporary literature in America to find people on the humanistic, if you know what I meant by that earlier, to openly theological end of the spectrum. And I think those are different positions, but they seem similar to me in certain regards. Both positions critiquing scholarship on religion as no less normative. And they will say things like, my syllabus has expectations and rules on it. You can't plagiarize. You can't use AI. These are normative rules. You're normative. It's all normative. Strikes me as a less than sincere reply. It strikes me that it's not difficult to distinguish normativity from normativity. Telling my student, they can't chew gum in class, kind of a very old school rule that you would associate maybe with the 1920s or something. I don't think it's difficult to distinguish that rule from saying this way of being Buddhist is the right way. Like, it strikes me that normativity with regard to methodology, this is how you do a description, this is how you do comparison. Normativity with regard to criteria for accepting students into degree programs. It strikes me that these are very different things than normativity with regard to the data, with regard to the content. I think it's possible to talk about Islam without taking sides in which form of Islam is better, best, original, with regard to Christianity, with regard to Judaism. I think we can talk about a lot of things without going down that road, while nonetheless having a number of normative standards about what counts as the study of religion, what counts as a student properly enrolled in my course. That distinction that I've drawn is routinely overlooked by those trying to critique a style of scholarship on religion that avoids getting meshed in the old categories, insider-outsider, in participant disputes. That's why a category like Hindu nationalism strikes me as very bothersome when coming out of the mouth of a scholar. It strikes me as a category that is being used to adjudicate, to judge between forms of Hinduism in this case, and which are legitimate and which are not, which follow the traditional rules of the liberal democratic nation state. Religion is private and compartmentalized. It is not part of political disputes. It's not public. These very old management techniques that have long worked, especially in European history, but are they now? Well, there's certain people in the world, at least in India and elsewhere, if we're going to use that example that I just put on the table of Hindu nationalism, who don't abide by that. We just saw a video interrupting us of people who don't abide by that distinction. And in the dispute to minimize that position, a dispute that personally you as a scholar may agree with for all I know, but people nonetheless easily, I think scholars, enter that theological political debate to moderate types of data. This is Hinduism, this is Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism, not a neutral descriptive term. It's clearly a ranked distinction. It is an inferior type, it is the wrong type, it is a problematic type. And then we see the humanists very quickly, which is always very curious to me, using explanatory methods, because usually we do not use explanatory methods, we use interpretive methods because we presume our object of study is deeply meaningful, so we must decode it properly. But when we come across that type of scholar, when they come across forms of the data that they find problematic, now the question is explanatory. Why did people even join that group, right? They quickly move to the explanatory, the reductive in the old language of the academy, and no longer are they here to interpret and potentially appreciate and conserve, like preserving the meaning. That's what they do with forms of the data they appreciate or value or take as normal or whatever we want to say. So for me, the different ways of studying religion really comes down to the degree to which a scholar, knowingly or not, may be aiming to conserve types of data with which they have affinity. And for me, that's problematic. So it's not about objectivity. It's about addressing biases, trying to articulate and make them public, and working hard for what I could, flippant is the wrong word, call an equal opportunity method. That we don't use different methods to study the people we like. How do we study all the things we look at in the same manner? What is the limits of that form of scholarship? We probably can't do everything with it. But if we're here to interpret the deep, abiding meaning of this, but when it comes to those we call cults, and there's that same management device. Hindu nationalism, I think, is managing that same spectrum of behavior that religion cult once managed. That's the deviant form, the wrong form, the extremist form. Instead of seeing them all as forms of human behavior implicated in social, political, authority issues. So how do we study the so-called Hindu nationalists in the exact same way that we study the Brahmin reciting rituals? And that's a real challenge for people because depending their political sensibilities, they easily in their scholarship seek to normalize a certain way of being Jewish, a certain way of being Buddhist, a certain way. And it's a way that for a lot of scholars is usually politically inconsequential, right? It's the twirling dervishes now that become the essential heart of the tradition. And we find that scholarship all over. It's the lone Buddhist monk meditating who becomes the essential heart of that tradition. And I find that typical world religions textbook approach pretty problematic because it's seeking to normalize a certain form of human behavior as religion that is politically inconsequential. And that framework strikes me as the framework of classic liberalism, if we mean by that a political philosophy traced to 17th century, 18th century, still in effect in many places, though one could argue changing pretty dramatically, even in places that have traditionally been known as liberal democracies. Is that helpful? Is that?
Yes, indeed, of course. I think the problem exactly is at a place or at a theoretical base of people who advocate for a phenomenological understanding of religion. They insist that if you do not get close to this subject, you're missing something, and you're missing something really important. And I think a step after that is that claiming that the proper study of religion is to get close to the subject and have some sort of a relationship with it so we can come up with good descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you insist or you have insisted that these descriptions are not critical, and you characterize phenomenological and hermeneutical method in religious studies as often reproducing insider claims without critical analysis. Can you elaborate on this, on the place of these phenomenological approach to religion?
The problem for me is back to what I said earlier, is that we end up treating people we like differently from people we don't like. I'm being flippant saying that. Let's say it a little more complicated. Hey, how would Bruce Lincoln at Chicago say it if you know his work? I don't know. We end up treating people for whom we have affinity differently than the people for whom we feel estrangement. And maybe that's a natural human reaction, group building. Scholars are humans. We're members of groups. But it strikes me that what we're aiming for is an equitable method that we use to study human behavior and what are its limits. So if the goal is to become close to the subject, the viewpoint that you just put on the table, to understand the secret handshake, to feel the feeling, to re-experience, and this is classic Iliadian scholarship, though people say they don't read Iliade over here anymore. Different places in the world, I think he still has certain pull or influence, but But regardless, reading him, it is a very common method. The presumption that we are, as I said earlier, here to re-experience and somehow reactualize, preserve, conserve, like a museum. We're conservators of these deep experiences. Well, if that's your method, my guess is a lot of the groups, and we've just been photobombed, that we as scholars probably should also be studying. We would never use that method in those cases. In some national settings, you might be prosecuted for using that method. You would certainly be criticized for presuming that there was some deep, abiding experience there that the scholar had to now re-experience for themselves. So the question becomes, why use this method in this situation, but not in that situation? And if it comes down to a question of, well, I have affinity for them and not for them, it just strikes me that now scholarship has just utterly fallen apart. If this is how we do our scholarship, that's how we do our social life. We treat our friends differently but scholarship is trying to move toward using a method that can just study people without trying to take sides in their disputes. So thus, I'm not a fan of talking about, if some of your guests and you know, the term mainline Protestantism. That's a very common term here. Mainline, one word, meaning dominant, meaning normal, meaning largely accepted, meaning the majority. Mainline Protestantism. And by this, in America, one would mean, Church of England in the UK maybe is mainline, and in America, is it Presbyterians or certain Protestant denominations, perhaps, depending who the speaker is? Well, depending who the speaker is, right? That term is actually what I would say socio-rhetorical. It's a way of talking about the world that is doing something in the world and trying to authorize one version in competition with a large number of alternatives that are also competing for attention. As a scholar, can I study Protestantism in this example without worrying about who's going to be the victor and come out as being the normal one, the dominant one? And instead, can I shift and study the contest itself? And thus, mainline Protestant is now in quotation marks for me because it is doing something. Like Roman Catholic, the universal Catholic Church centered in Rome, like this is the derivation of these terms, Catholic. That's a socio-rhetorical claim that's being made. And you don't make that claim if you're not in contest with others. Shia Sunni, Theravada, Hinayana Mahayana. We see it all over. And why wouldn't we see it all over if we presume, social theory, that no social group is uniform? They all have contradictions and subgroups within them, competitions for dominance. If this is just how social life works, then we should expect in the domain we study, if it is an example of human behavior, nothing more, nothing less, interesting behavior, we should expect to see those same contests being waged. And as a scholar, can we work hard not to normalize the contest? Normalize the victors, or the people who think they're the victors. So for a scholar of religion, I would hope we become interested in not what tradition is. Tradition, too, is a socio-rhetorical term to me. For me, why do you do that? Well, it's tradition. Well, you've just repeated that you do it. In other words, why do you do it the same each year? You could change how you do it. You don't do it because it's tradition. For some other reason, you repeat the behaviors and minimize the variations that are inevitable every time you do it, as if it is permanent and similar. So saying something is a tradition, to me, is like saying something is mainline Protestantism. It's a rhetorical claim you're making that fails to see variety that is nonetheless still happening, and fails to explain why, when there could be variety, you and people for whom you have affinity opt not for the variety. What is that doing for you? What is that conserving? How does that affect identity? All kinds of issues we can now explore instead of simply putting, as scholars, a stamp of approval on how the people we study already talk about their own worlds. So for me, the scholarly move is not objectivity. It's it's a degree of alienation. It's a degree of alienation and distance from the practices of the people we study and learning how to become curious about them as normal, mundane, ordinary practices. It doesn't mean they're not interesting, but it means developing a way to find the mundane ordinary. And by mundane, I mean, people raising children, people choosing who you can and can't marry. That's what is the limit of the group? How do we maintain a certain sense of the group? Well, who within the group gets to say what the group is? We know there's subgroups. We know there's contests. There's a host of fascinating things to study, it seems to me, without taking the step of normalizing how either dominant or marginal people within those groups are trying to work within their own group. So that's how the objectivity discussion for me resolves. It's not about being objective. It means, can you be a little alienated? Here in the US and maybe internationally, Bob Orsi's work is very popular, people, if anyone knows that scholar. Often studying American Catholics. So issues of immigration become important, issues of second and third generation, very interesting things, yes. But a lot of the scholarship is centered on groups for which he has affinity and an inside status already. An uncle, a grandfather, an anecdote, like fieldwork, an anthropologist, but an anthropologist who's already a member of the group, and thus the plus for many would be who therefore has deep access to the inside experience, that position you put on the table, Maddie, earlier. Well, it strikes me as problematic because these others you're studying, I've written about this before, they're no cost others. There's no challenge. You're part of the group. And of course, people are going to read it and find your description of your uncle endearing because you have an endearing relationship with your uncle. It's wonderful. It's fun to read, of course. But you would never study, now let's go back to Hindu nationalist. Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist. That's a category that gets used there, even though, how ironic, because Buddhism is ethereal and otherworldly. We know the stereotype, right? We've never used that method there because our job as a scholar now is no longer to make the people seem endearing. It's now to explain why the hell are they doing such crazy things. All right, quote unquote. I hope people get the sarcastic tone I'm using here. And again, that's why that becomes a problem for me, is because we're picking and choosing based on prior affinities, which are going to be very different in your case from me, from whomever is watching this. I see the names across the top. And now I don't know how to have a field or a discipline or whatever you want to call it if every office in my department, where there's an office door and a professor, if we're all using a different method and studying different things, I don't know what the study of religion is now, much less the study of Islam, much less the study of Hinduism, much less the study of Republicans versus Democrats in America. If we're just using insider affinity language to kind of massage social identity. So the methodological issues we're talking about strike me as going to the very heart of, does the field exist? Is there a field? And I don't even mean internationally. I mean, in my own department, in your own. Or is it just a happenstance conglomeration of people who each do their own thing? I would hope it would be the former, but that probably requires us to recognize there are limits to what we do. Thus far, probably no further. We're going to put a different hat on as a person when we do that other thing. I'm rambling.
Thank you. And Just my last question. I worry if I ask a few more, I would taken up the time of Q&A. So this would be the last one. This, if we are critical about the use of method and theory and the categories and how we describe the data, we can engage in critical study of religion, which doesn't serve the identity politics or doesn't serve the victor. And my question is, what is the future of religious studies if the knowledge is not going to serve identity politics or serve the victors or serve the presupposition that that in many cases might be the reason that we initiated the research at the beginning. In many cases, the institutions are supported by this identity politics, and the research actually is started and funded by these reasons. What would be the future?
That's a question, I think, that presupposes a conversation on what is the purpose of a university? What is the purpose of scholarship? And there's probably 18 purposes. Like, these are not simple questions. In America right now, parts of Europe, I'm not that familiar with the university context in Iran, parts of Canada. Anyone following the news who's listening to this might more than know, there's a lot of closures happening in American universities. If you've not followed the news, you might think a lot of that is related to current criticisms coming from the federal government. No, I would say these are decades-long trends in America, specifically. Other places too, but I'll use where I am as an example, that have been slowly but consistently reinventing what higher education is in America. So if we recognize that what is the university, a thing that many people for centuries have written on, this is a very long and old tradition of a university of higher education. Many people have debated it. So if we see that as not a settled issue, but an ongoing debate, what is the university? If you're able to persuade people that in part what a university is, what research is basic sciences. And I don't know if you would phrase it that way. And often we use that term with regard to the natural sciences. People doing experiments for no practical gain. We're just doing basic science research. And the great irony is that, show a technological innovation that affects all of our lives, right? Well, that's premised on basic science research from a long time ago that was done simply to find out what would happen in this scenario that somebody much later found a practical application for. Some of it, no practical application. If that model of a university works in someone's mind, then I would say the study of religion, as I understand it, is in part of the basic sciences, to understand how social groups work, how social contests work, how social authority works, when part of your repertoire as a social actor is this technique that is often called religion, this technique of saying, you don't know because you haven't experienced it. Like, that's a very common, and that's the move you put on the table. That's a very common move. And we often call that religion, not always, but this kind of insider privileging technique that we can do. I don't know if you would say this, but we would certainly say if somebody's laughing and somebody arrives, well, you had to be there. You had to be there to get the joke. And that's inconsequential. It's not mean, but there's the move. There's a presumptive, normative group, a marginal group, something happened there. Now, if we could take it not just from group to the presumption of an interior, ethereal experience that is only in some polluted manner put into the public realm, expressed, that's a very common presumption to the thing that many of us study as religion, that it is the sum total of the derivative expressions, myth, symbol, ritual, that common threesome that we often use. It's the sum total of the derivative expressions that, if studied properly, can allow you to infer something about the pristine inner non-expressible experience. That's a very, well, if we start to see that as a basic social technique groups use to do something, to distinguish, to rank, to negotiate. And the trouble is, the minority position is doing that no less than the dominant position. If that's what we see to be going on, then the study of religion provides us with a very basic place to study those contests, especially over time. Basic science research to me. If instead the study of religion, which is now, I think, what is happening in especially American universities, if the study of religion is practiced in a context where a university is instead understood as, and I think that's the term in your university name, as a technical institute, we're here to teach careers. We're here to get people professional credentials. An instrumentalized view, right? That we're here for practical application. Then it gets tougher to do the study of religion as I've described it. Because now religion, well, it's associated with the helping professions. Maybe I'll become a social worker. Maybe I'll, right? You didn't freeze, did you? Okay.
No.
In that view, which is increasingly becoming prominent in the US, if you follow our news, you will see not just the humanities, a designation we'll use for certain kind of subjects that were classically thought to be close to the enduring human spirit and its expressions, but also the natural sciences. There are mathematics departments being closed, physics departments being closed, because very few students in their first degree will major in that subject. Those subjects at an undergraduate level are largely teaching breadth requirement courses to other students. The engineers have to take their calculus course. So maybe if we're cutting costs, we don't need a whole math department. We'll just need a few instructors to teach calculus. That traditionally was thought to hit the humanities hard, but now it's hitting many of the traditional liberal arts, as we would call them, which includes natural sciences for me, geography, under the presumption that a well-educated citizen should know a language, should know something about music history, a very Renaissance European view of the humanities. That model is changing here dramatically. So if that continues to change as it seems, then the study of religion, as I described it, becomes a hard sell, if you know what I mean, if you're talking to an administrator to establish a budget for a department, salaries, faculty lines, because for all you know, their model of the study of religion is being able to teach a world religions course to the business students so they understand something about the world being a bigger place, because the business school probably has an internationalizing requirement for their business students. So to answer the question, and I hope I'm not seeming to be evading it, it really requires us to say, what is a university? What is scholarship? What is its purpose? And if a society doesn't want to invest in basic science research, then that's a decision they're making. It will certainly impact the future of these things. Nobody set out to invent an iPhone. An iPhone was something that could be made after all kinds of other things had been invented that had no necessary link to even to telecommunication. But now that they have been discovered, we can put these things together in a novel way. So I hope you hear me as not criticizing technological innovation, but the very thing that we're talking on right now, the internet, nobody set about to invent a way for us to have a Zoom. It was very basic science research. My gosh, just to figure out how to send meaningful light pulses down a glass line, fiber optic cables. Like nobody anticipated Zoom. That's how I see the study of religion as I practice it. It's a basic science interested in how groups work. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not aware that the students I teach might not become professors, right? The job market is incredibly tight right now. It's very bad shape given those closures. So, in seeing it as basic science research, how can you also understand how the tools necessary for doing it, how can they be applied elsewhere? My assumption they have wide application. I would love the students who I teach and who learn things. Why aren't they working for the UN? Why aren't they working for large corporations? Why aren't they working for non-governmental agencies? Why aren't they working for the government? Not studying religion. They know something how identity works, how social contests work, how systems of rank and preference work, how ambiguity works, and how social groups rebel against ambiguity often and want very clear impressions. They know how all that works, and I'm thinking a host of settings probably needs that skill and expertise, even though they never study religion anymore. So in saying that I see the study of religion as I practice it as a basic science, don't think that means that it doesn't have wide practical application. Basic science insights have wide practical implications. And I think as a scholar of religion in today's university, at least where I live, you have to be nimble and be able to talk about both things. Is that
Thank
a
you.
familiar thing where you are in a university, or is that an alien balance to you?
Describing religious studies as a basic science, I think it was really hopeful for all of us to hear that. Uh, in this particular time where religious studies and particularly Islamic studies or Middle Eastern studies is being under attack or being threatened, all those closures you told us about, uh, make us all think about what would happen next and what would the future of this field. And describing it as a basic science, I think, opens door for all of us.
But to
And I
do
think,
that, I think you have to be skilled at not taking your object of study for granted. Like I will jokingly say that's the view that animates, you haven't read the Bhagavad Gita? Like we're all like that because we happen to have come across something when we were 19 or 25 or who knows when, who knows for what reason, that fascinates us. And we want to do a deep dive into the text or the behavior or the group and we're going to learn languages and that's great. But we become so immersed in it that we fail to remember what we were all like at 19 when we didn't take that as self-evidently important. We came to see that over time. So that means as an early teacher, we often walk into classrooms and just proclaim our interest instead of bringing the students along to also see it as interesting. Early career teachers often give to their introductory students the things that they themselves are reading, and they treat the students as if they're dialogue partners, failing to think, no, 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 they're 19, they're 20. I just got to bring them along in these 10 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever your semester is. A. B, we take it as so self-evidently important to study. Have you read the Bhagavad Gita? That we fail to see that part of our job, basic science application, part of our job is to generalize from that finding and to see the thing that we did the deep dive into studying, years of our studies. What is the generalizable conclusion we can bring from that that me, who doesn't study the Bhagavad Gita, might find as relevant for my work? And that's where I come back to, how do groups work? How does identity work? How do social contests work? How do, like, groups are historical things. Nobody's a Roman citizen anymore. They come and they go. So they go through dominant phases, ascendant, emergent, residual phases. There's all kinds of things that we, even though we did our deep dive in some Shinto temple architecture history, I bet if we realize we're not here to take that as self-evidently important, the deep experience, right? You know what I'm critiquing here. We could probably generalize from that finding to something that architecture students should be reading. Not because they should learn about religion, but because in this example, I'm able to illustrate something kind of interesting about how we build buildings and make habitable space for ourselves. But scholars of religion, in my experience, are very bad at that generalizable move because I think we all generally take the Bhagavad Gita as so self-evidently, eternally important, and we fail to challenge ourselves to say, and now I'm just being Jonathan Smith in this, if any of you have read Jonathan Smith. If we fail to say, so what? Like, why is it interesting? Because if any of you have walked into a shopping mall that you're not familiar with, or traveled to a country that is new, everything is self-evidently interesting to you. You don't know where to look. It's all competing for your attention. We don't know how to manage it and narrow down, and that's the thing I want to look at. Scholars of religion are already well immersed in the narrowing, and we forget that, well, not everybody's reading the Bhagavad Gita. Well, why is it relevant for somebody else? Well, it's an instance of in group, a contest, and how we get people to, not that I'm going to go read it, but now me and the scholar who's done it, we have something to talk about on the level of theory. We don't share the data, and that's where I think the discipline of religion, the field of religion exists, not on the level of data. It's on the level of questions and curiosities and methods. Thus, in my department, I don't study the same thing as anybody in my department. There's 14 of us, and nobody studies the same thing as anybody else. But most of us are united on the questions, and we understand that at each of these, microbiologists growing bacteria, we call it a petri dish, right? The agar, we all use a different petri dish. We all do the experiment somewhere else. But we're trying to generalize our findings to inform other people doing the same experiments, but in different places, at different times, a temple, a text, a ritual. I ramble.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to take any more questions. I think we have a few interesting questions from our audience. I'd like to ask you if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand so I can unmute you. We have a few written questions which I can read right now. Let's start with some of those written questions. Mr. Sabet asked, are academic norms able to handle the supernatural, which is undeniably a part of all religions?
Well, for me, I would say that all I study are claims people make, right? Like, I don't even think I study experiences. I don't know. I've written on this. We could go into some depth on that category experience. Like, at the end of the day, we study what people say or what they put into a text or a piece of architecture as something left over from someone who was here. We study claims. And if what we study are claims, we never study the supernatural. We never study beliefs, if you want to press me. We study people who claim to have beliefs. We use that word belief, at least in English, as if it somehow pairs up with some internal thing in people. No, it too is a claim someone's making. And when I say claim, I don't mean to insinuate that they're manipulative or insincere, and perhaps they really do think something is happening in wherever beliefs are. I'm not sure where they are. I guess we think they're in our heads, and we think our feelings are in our heart. How silly will people in the future think we are when they think that we had things in our heart called feelings, eh? Because the ancients thought these things were in different places than we think they are, right? But whatever. They might think that quite sincerely, and I'm not here to argue with them. The only evidence that my method can deal with is something empirical, something I hear, something I read, I see, So whether those things really are out there in here, my method can't get at that. I have, as a scholar, I'm interested in the claims people make. Claims of experience, claims of belief, and if pressed, um, I I think those are all hindsight done later, hindsight fabrications. And I could, if anyone's interested, find I've written on this, other people have written on this. Like, I don't think you've had a belief until you bump into people who do something different than you do. I think now you say, well, I believe you should put the pepper on before the salt. And this comes straight from, if any of you know, there's a new edition out, but it's a classic 1998 book, Critical Terms for Religious Studies. The article Belief is a very interesting article written by a scholar of Buddhism. And he concludes, and I'm very persuaded, that belief is an agonistic, okay, the same root as the word agony in English, meaning a contest. Belief is evidence of a social contest, belief claims. And I don't think you have belief until you have an unanticipated contest moment, and that you use this claim of interiority to try to win the moment, to authorize. Because prior to that, I don't think people are dumb. You got to hear me the right way. They're sophisticated, but I don't think they have beliefs. I don't think right now I have beliefs. If queried by an outsider, I can now generate the idea that I have beliefs. I think beliefs are the result of social moments, almost like ethnography and anthropology. If I'm a critical anthropologist, I don't think there are insiders until the outsider shows up and says, why do you do that? And until that question happens, I don't think the participant necessarily has a reason why they're doing it. They're just fully immersed in the doing. They know how to do this. They're more than capable as an intelligent, sophisticated thinker to come up with an answer to that question. But in the doing, I think we are fully immersed as human beings. Like no one right now is thinking about what their shoes feel like on their feet. Now you are. Like you were just fully immersed in the doing prior to that. And I tend to think that that word experience, that word belief, functions in that same fashion. It's a residue of a social moment. So when I hear the supernatural, I hear a claim being made. I'm interested in why that claim would be made. Why would someone claim that there is a prehistorical, transhistorical, whatever we mean by that? That's something I can study. Whether that thing is actually there, whether it's uniform among all religious people, the perennialists, say Eliade, Joseph Campbell, Houston Smith, if you know that tradition in scholarship, they were interested in that question, as many people still are. That's not a question that I am necessarily pursuing. Is that a nice way of saying what I'm trying to say?
I think yes. However, if anyone have a question or Mr. Sabat have a question, I think you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask yourself. For me, it was clear. The way you portray religious studies, I think it has something to do, if you want to describe the behavior of people in elections, describe the behavior of people when they want to buy something. I think religious studies can provide essential insights into that behavior as a basic science. And I don't know if I'm describing it all right. I
If
understood
we
your...
can agree that religion is not about religion, never is, belief is not about belief. You know, that whole thing I did right there? Well, let's start applying that more widely. If we agree, and a lot of people don't, if we agree that claims of religiosity, oh, that's a church, that's a mosque, they are religious places. if we can agree that we're not interested in the religiosity of them, whatever that even means, but instead interested in the classificatory move that that person just did, that is a bowling alley, that is not a bowling alley. Okay, the stakes aren't very high in that classificatory dispute. That is legal, that is illegal. Oh, the stakes are a little higher in that classificatory dispute. But we know that that classificatory distinction is a historical phenomenon because a new legislature gets elected and suddenly marijuana is legal. Oh, no, a new legislature comes in and suddenly alcohol is illegal. We know legal, illegal is a historical phenomenon that groups use to manage behavior in ways that many of us might agree with. I think it is very good that driving on the wrong side of the road is illegal. But I know it is still nonetheless a historical phenomenon, one that I happen to agree with, promotes certain interests I have, to live a long life, to get to the airport safely, whatever. Well, can we look at myth history that way? Can we look at ritual habit that way? There's nothing ritually about rituals. Can we see the classificatory distinction like mainline Protestant, a classificatory taxon that's doing something? What is it doing? And come all the way to supernatural natural, religious political, sacred secular. So if that's the move you make, and I've written much on this, anybody who's read even a little of me maybe here's what I'm saying is a little boring, then I think the scholar of religion in that vein, in that way, is studying a basic site where culture-wide techniques are used that are generalizable to elections, yes, to social disputes within a country, yes, to conflicts within a family when someone wants to be a lawyer and father wants them to be a doctor. Like, I don't know. I think human beings do these things all over. We portray our classifications as disinterested, as eternal, when a little bit of history makes it very clear that they change over time, they're tactical. Could you do this with privacy in public? There's nothing private about private. We know governments debate what should count as private. We make laws about this. That parents don't burst into their teenager's room. Well, they might at some times when they smell the wrong smell or I don't know what. That privacy is a social construct within groups. If we can do those classificatory moves there to understand that, then how much more interesting is sacred and secular going to become? What's going on in these cases where the stakes are very high to groups? You know, it's like me putting up a fence between me and my neighbor. There's something going on here. What is going on? How does that work? What's at stake? The fence suggests it could be otherwise, and I don't want it to be otherwise. Where it could not be otherwise, there is no other way it could be, we'll probably not put up the fence. Putting up the fence is evidence. Police forces are evidence that it could be otherwise. Lines on the highway are evidence that it could be otherwise. And comparing where people drive in England to where people drive here, there, it could be otherwise, you know? So show me a classificatory system and I'll show you someone trying to manage that it could be otherwise. Well, why are they trying to manage it? Who wants it otherwise? What will that world look like when it's otherwise? So many fascinating things to study without ever taking sides in the dispute. So I think the study of religion, as I understand, is a basic science that studies fences. We're studying fences.
Yes. I think this style of religious studies is transformative and it has many consequences. Specifically, in the case of Islamic studies, it can change a lot of things. It can dissolve a lot of hot issues that we are dealing with. And I take this opportunity to invite you and everyone else to join our school, which is going to take place at this weekend, where we are going to discuss method and theory in Islamic studies, and we are going to specifically focus on objectivity. I took this opportunity. Uh, we
I
have,
think Ibrahim, I see Ibrahim's question, and
yes.
it's at Hamid Reza. I think Ibrahim should ask Aaron Hughes during the school that question about belief practice. Um, I think a basic management device groups need is a way to create the impression of uniformity despite diversity. And that belief practice distinction is right in the midst of that management technique. Ask Aaron about that.
We have two more questions. One of them is asked from me. Uh, Professor McCutcheon, thank you for your insight. If we treat religion entirely as a product of discourse and power structure, how do we avoid overlooking the sincere, lived experiences of religious individuals? In other words, is there room in your approach for understanding how people find real meaning and agency through religion, and not just how religion functions socially or politically? Thank you.
Oh, we're running out of time, aren't we? Um, I'm not a fan. You know, that term comes from fanatic, eh? Etymologically, the term fan comes from fanatic. But now we think of a football fan. I'm not a fan of lived experience or religion on the ground. And maybe some of you hearing me can guess that because it seems to prioritize the really real as opposed to the derivative, the insincere. Like those very distinctions to me are again managing our data in a particular way. And given the approach to the experience as a way of talking about the world that I take, I don't think people have experiences until they're asked about these things. I don't think you and I have experiences in us. I think experience is a social category that results from situations. So when I see lived experience talked about, I always feel that the scholar is downplaying or failing to understand their role in conjuring those things into existence, like the ethnographer whose questions produce the identity of an insider. And the great critique of ethnography that they only talk to the village elders, they only talk to the men, they only talk to the right, and it conjured a certain kind of group into existence in the literature that failed to talk to the children, talk to the women, talk to the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, talk to different people, but the scholar is actively constituting those groups into existence, I think, those identities, by their very questions. Questions which betray how they think the world is. And there's thus a dialogical creation of insider outsider in the moment. So for me, there's no insiders till the outsider shows up. And often it's an outsider with a research grant who came from a more powerful place, who came on a jet, or came in the 19th century on a British Navy ship. And so thus now ethnography is deeply implicated in politics. And now we're back to Said. And now we're, yes, 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 1,000 times yes. But despite that critique, we all still talk about the East and the West. It's kind of fascinating. We think we read our Said, but we're still all talking about East and West. We're all as if it's a natural thing. And so that to me is, even if we're trying to be critically minded scholars, the temptation to come back to, well, there's like an Eastern mentality. Well, a lot of us don't talk that way anymore, but I think it still animates what we're doing. So scholars of Islam are not talking about the Muslim mind anymore, I hope, But I mean, it's probably not difficult to find certain assumptions still animating the literature, even in ways we might agree with, or have affinity for. So the critical turn some of us have in mind means we have to be really mindful, mainline Protestant, lived experience, as if there's a more authentic way of being a Buddhist. And that's a long tradition that goes back to social history in the 1960s, right? How do we get behind the men who are in charge and talk about, British working class women in the early 19th century who don't appear in the archive, right? Their names were not in the newspapers, the usual places we did our research. So experience became the category those scholars used, thinking they could get behind the dominant authoritative sources. Joan Wallach Scott, if anybody's interested, Wallach. If you're interested, I'll put the name here.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm typing evidence of experience. Find that review essay. It's in a University of Chicago journal. I think 1991, the journal called Critical Inquiry. She's still alive. She's a very senior American historian, scholar, historian. It's a review essay of 2 books that use the category experience. One in gay culture. It's a 1991. These are older books. And the experience of being gay in San Francisco in the 70s. That's what the book's about. And she zeroes in on that category experience, saying, what's going on when we say that word? It's a long essay. It's a book review essay. But her punchline is, we're here to study the rhetoric of experience. Experience is a certain way we talk and a certain way we do something socially with each other. And it's an error to think that emission from our mouth, experience, it's wrong to think it pairs up with something mysterious inside here. It's a fascinating article. And if you're in any way interested in this, find Raymond Williams' little book called Key Words. Raymond Williams was a Marxist literary critic in England, so he studied literature. But he wrote Key Words, which is a collection of critical vocabulary he thought were needed in culture studies. It's from the 70s, I think. But his essay on experience, it's like 3 pages. Little, right? If you can use the word experience, where does the word come from? How do people use it? Makes a very important distinction. There's 2 fundamental English language uses of experience. One is empirical, one is non-empirical. The way we're talking, it's that one we're talking about, as if it pairs up with some interior thingness, right? A disposition, a sentiment. But isn't it interesting that the exact same word in English language means something completely empirical? Do you have work experience? Now it's something demonstratable. It's on my CV. We use that word experience to mean utterly public, verifiable things, but we also use it in this other way. So that very word's history has the distinction in it. I'm among those trying to recover that other way of using it. It's a public rhetorical term, like work experience. It's observable. People using the word, talking, conditions that make it possible for you to experience. Somebody wrote, an architect I read once wrote, a covered porch with a metal roof and a fine glass of wine is a place to experience the rain. Being stuck in the rain is very different. So what are the conditions needed to be constructed in order for you to have something that you think is an experience? Thus, experience is an architectural phenomenon. It's a social phenomenon, like privacy. It's a political phenomenon. It doesn't predate all those things. It's a condition that results from all those things. And thus, I think you can study the sociology of experience. Not the place it's expressed, but the place it's invented. and then internalized as if it was always there to begin with. You all don't have to agree with me, but if you have any interest, go find Joe Walk-Scott's, and it's long. You got to bear with her. Stick with it. The punchline comes later. I've taken up too much of your time. We're at an end, aren't we?
Yes. Thank you for introducing these works. These are really interesting. Okay, I think we're at the end. We have a few more questions. I have to apologize. We can't address them. Thank you for dedicating your time to us, and thank you everyone for joining us. I apologize for the incident we had at the beginning, and thank you for coming again and
Good
trying
luck
to.
to everybody, and ask Aaron Hughes all the tough questions. Give me the easy ones.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's good to meet you, and have yourselves a wonderful weekend.
It was an honor.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Marty.